The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, a podcast for Star Wars fans looking to connect real-world science, technology, and fields of study to the galaxy far, far away. Today, we're going to chat about psychology with our guest expert, Dr. Drea Letamendi. I'm James Floyd.
And I'm Melissa Miller. We're both freelance writers for Star Wars Insider magazine and both big nerds for all things academic and all things Star Wars.
Today we have Dr. Drea Letamendi on the show, and we'll be asking the question of, would Kylo Ren be a well-adjusted character if he had just learned mindfulness? As well as other topics like how the Mandalorian would cope after he finds out he's part of a cult, and if there's any well-adjusted characters in all of Star Wars. Thanks so much for being here, Drea.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. This is the exact kind of show that I feel like is for me. Like, I would listen to the show. It sounds like these are all the things. This is the intersection of science, of science fiction, of fictional narrative, all the things that I love. So, and of course, Star Wars. So it's such an honor to be here.
Wow, we're going to have you write blurbs for our show. Yeah, so thanks for being here today.
I think this is how I live my life. Like, I'm not even kidding. My professional identity is characterized through storytelling and fictional narrative. So this show seems to embrace that. So it's really cool that I'm a part of it. So thank you.
Yeah. For a while, I gave myself grief for just overanalyzing things and, why can't I just enjoy it? And at this point, I've just embraced it about myself and I'm really leaning into it. So that's what the show's about.
Awesome.
You mentioned, looking at the storytelling and kind of how it connects to characters. You are a clinical psychologist and mental health educator. What is clinical psychology?
Clinical psychology is a subfield of psychological science that really focuses on mental disorders and behaviors, emotions that might indicate distress. Clinical psychology is a pretty big umbrella, though, and even though my original training is in clinical psychology, my PhD was in clinical psychology, I'd say that there are some overlapping areas in psychology that this touches, right? Pandemic stress is an example. I've been seeped in this work because of COVID. So talking about stress management and resilience building and work-life balance, that doesn't sound like clinical psychology because we're not directly addressing depression, anxiety disorders, or serious mental illness, but these are all things on a spectrum. These all go together. So I've been really lucky to have pretty rigorous training in clinical psychology, and then I've been able to kind of branch that out in much of the work that I do.
So how did you first become interested in clinical psychology, and was Star Wars at all an influence?
Batman was a huge influence when I was about 12, 13. I was really, really fascinated with superheroes and just the original aspects of like detective work, exploring the mind and seeing people as a product of their experiences and their traumas, not so much just sort of a black and white version of our psychology. And Star Wars was a huge part of my personal sense of self. I grew up watching Star Wars and really being drawn towards Star Wars because of its storytelling, themes around redemption, retribution, themes around forgiveness, and people not being perfect. So a lot of this dovetailed when I went into psychology and used these really, I think, relatable journeys, these fictional journeys, to have discussions and to bring awareness about psychology, I think, in ways that people kind of like can gravitate to. It builds trust. It builds common ground. If I run into somebody and see that they're wearing a Star Wars shirt and I'm wearing a Star Wars shirt, like that just accelerates our connection, right? There's something right away that we can talk about. And that, I think, is such an important part of connecting and finding meaningful bonds with one another. So I've always been really fascinated with with that trio, my relationship with these fictional characters, and then my relationship with other people and how these all sort of go together.
Should we be concerned that you have a Imperial cog tattooed on your shoulder?
Not at all. Not at all. The story behind my tattoo, and I only have one, is that when I achieved my internship after graduate school and completed my PhD, I decided to go ahead and bond with Star Wars in a way that was very self-aware, and also in a way that was very authentic. The three of us are around the same age. When you grow up in the 80s and 90s, you realize that being into science fiction and fantasy wasn't exactly cool. It wasn't mainstream. So I dealt with a lot of the challenges of that. And the moment in which I could tell myself, it doesn't matter. I accomplished what I wanted to do personally. I finished my education. I just want to be authentic with what I love. I decided to go ahead and get the tattoo. And the Imperial sign is not so much about the whatever ideology behind the Empire, not at all. It's more about this concept, my personal connection to Star Wars, and this concept of forgiveness and compassion, that at some point we had to see the entire arc that Anakin went through. And that for me, growing up, this was really about a story of development and change. And this really was about forgiving the self and changing towards something really good. He had to get through quite a bit to end up there. But for me, that's really what that symbol means.
So since your field of expertise really is, all people and all relationships, there's obviously a lot of relevance in Star Wars and a lot of potential there. But what is something that really stands out to you? Maybe the first time you even noticed your field sort of represented in Star Wars, or whatever stands out to you the strongest?
That's a great question. I don't think I was as perceptive with psychology in Star Wars as I was when I look at superheroes. But what I do appreciate so much that has been a golden thread throughout the Star Wars mythology is this concept of belongingness and purpose, that any one of us, certainly we all go through our own hero's journey and we struggle and we're unsure about what our place is in this universe. This idea, though, that you can face those struggles, and I'd say more with Rey than with Luke, that you can be authentically yourself and find your purpose in this big chaotic universe is really powerful. And a part of that also comes from, I mentioned belongingness. A part of this comes from a lot of exploration and discovery about who we are as people and individually. Who am I as a person? Where do I belong? Who do I belong with? Where do I see people like me? And I don't mean my outward appearance necessarily. I also mean my culture, my values, my sense of what's important. And we see a lot of individual characters move through the universe with these very same questions. And not all of it is very simple and streamlined. Some of it, the sequel trilogy, I think, as controversial as it's been and as dramatic as it's been, is, I think it's really what I've told friends when we debate about this is it's such a cool landscape as a psychologist. There's so many different directions I can go in, and it's not perfect. And I appreciate that about some of the storytelling.
But how am I to know the good side from the bad?
You will know when you are calm, at peace, passive.
Yeah, I was thinking with the different trilogies, if some of our awareness here on Earth of topics and mindfulness and, talking more about our emotions and being more in touch with ourselves, if that sort of seeps into the writer's room, like the original trilogy written in the 70s and 80s, then, 90s and early aughts. And then now I feel like those writer's rooms are going to be more self-aware over those decades. So I sort of wonder if that trickled into the characters at all.
Absolutely. And I'd say, about mindfulness, The Force itself, and there's a ton of interpretations, right? Religious interpretations, mythological interpretations. There could be hours of conversation about just this subtopic. But I'd say for me, the Force, even before the sequel, the Force represented this bond that we have and this connection to everybody, every living being. It is almost like this concept of collective liberation, that I can't see myself or exist without knowing my relationship to every other person, creature, being. And that's pretty remarkable. Like, that's a radical idea that came to us, in the late 70s.
That is so basically just that, recognizing that we are interconnected with everything. Yeah, that is a big thing. And I think a lot of people got that from that idea from Star Wars, when you talk about the Force being, what binds the universe together.
Absolutely. In the sequels, and this is what compelled me to actually write a chapter about mindfulness in Star Wars. The sequel trilogy, I think, really embraces this concept of the Force being available to all of us, but really requires control and really requires a sense of a certain mental state and connection. So in particular, Kylo Ren and Rey are not perfect, right? And many of the characters are not, but of course they are relatable, they're realistic. And Kylo Ren in particular presents with upsetting psychological features. These are negative thinking patterns and dysregulated internal states, that some joke that he's sort of like the quintessential emo boy. But if you really think about what's going on, he's dealing with a tremendous amount of trauma, of lack of belongingness. He's, lost. And he really struggles with these impulses. And mindfulness is really helpful when we're trying to manage depression-related, trauma-related, anger-related impulses. It allows us to calm the body, to become more aware of our internal state, to reflect on our relationship with those impulses. Is that really me? If it's me, do I have to act on them? And I think, Kylo Ren alone is a really, really helpful character as a psychologist to talk about negative attributes like impulsive, aggressive thoughts or feelings of distress and depression, and how a practice like mindfulness or a collective practice of mindfulness techniques can actually help a young person manage through those difficult experiences and gain more self-regulation. And we see in his journey that he doesn't necessarily directly use mindfulness, but he uses many techniques around calming the self and being present with the self in order to reach a more healing and stable state.
What are some examples of some of those mindfulness techniques that he kind of draws on to help him control his behavior and thoughts?
Yeah, so for folks who are not familiar with mindfulness, this is the state we're in when we're paying attention in a non-judgmental manner to our present experiences. We do this with intention. We do this with openness. And when I say being non-judgmental, I mean that we are allowing the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences to be in our state, in our existence. And we're not yelling at ourselves for thinking that way or feeling that way. We're very accepting. And when we bring awareness to those experiences, observing the self without judgment and becoming more aware of our personal complex self, we do experience immediate relief. There's calmness that brings. There's tremendous insight. And so to answer your question, what Kylo Ren does, and obviously Rey does this first, and Rey does this better in the very beginning of her story. When we're introduced to her, she is simply being. There's this, I put this in the chapter, there's this moment where she's just foraged, like she had just gone on a day, she had like a day's work. She had gotten her rations. She's, eating this very humble meal, and she is present with herself in such a remarkable way. It doesn't, we know that she's longing for something. We know that she's not exactly assured about who she's supposed to be in the universe, but she certainly is practicing mindfulness in the sense that she is able to sit with her feelings and thoughts and able to perceive the world around her and her positioning, her present state with that world. Kylo Ren is totally dysregulated, and when he feels a feeling, it's just an outburst. So he doesn't do this as well. But I think, James, to answer your question, over time, we do see him take pause and take some moments. It's for me, it's that moment where he sees his father in that sort of pseudo memory, and has this exchange, this mental exchange. And for me, that's a sense of taking pause to reflect on his own sense of self. And to get very technical, this can be done wherever you are. I wouldn't do this driving a car or managing a vehicle, but you can do this wherever you are. You can be sitting in a chair, you can be standing in line, you can be on a yoga mat. There are many versions of mindfulness, but we are all equipped to do this. In fact, I'm very pleased to see mindfulness in a lot of our media.
What are some other examples?
The Sound of Metal, that recent movie that was nominated for an Academy Award about a musician, a drummer who lost his hearing. That was a movie that didn't mention mindfulness, but really showed a lot of positive attributes of mindfulness. And then a lot of Disney Pixar movies have shown mindfulness. Inside Out is an example. Soul is an example. I should mention that Amy Ratcliffe wrote The Jedi Mind, which is all about how characters in Star Wars can practice techniques of calming the body and providing stillness and relaxation. So this is not something I like, I'm not the only person who's made this connection.
Stretch out with your feelings.
When you were talking about it being a non-judgmental practice, I really started to think about how judgmental the Jedi really can be, and
Yes.
It's something I think that struck me even as a kid, where, what is it? Anger leads to hate, leads to suffering. And it's like, okay, but sometimes you're going to have anger. Sometimes you're going to have violent feelings. And they're always so dismissive of it, where I feel like if you were allowed to just feel the anger and move through it or identify it or something and move on, then this could work out. But to me, it seems sort of inevitable that the Jedi are going to collapse if they have to be such a pure, group of people that they can't ever feel anger.
I agree completely. And I definitely have criticized when Amy and I had our podcast together, we would have discussions about the Jedi and some of their failures in their principles and practices. But I completely agree. And so a part of, when you're drawing this connection, a part of it too is whether it's Sith or Jedi, because Sith do this too. They do an extreme version of this. They actually get really wrapped it up in the emotion. And that's not mindfulness either, because it's almost this extreme form of distraction, because the emotion has swept them away and now they're being guided by these negative emotions. So it's, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it means that we can kind of establish where the real psychology and the real science, what does this say, and how does Star Wars evidence those practices and those ideas, and where do they go in a different direction, and how can we learn from that?
Yeah, what is actually healthy and what ends up not being healthy, even though we're presented that these people are the good guys, they aren't necessarily practicing the most healthy things for themselves.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I bring up Kylo Ren, and I'm glad that sort of the Jedi and Sith philosophies come up. As part of their practices, Sith emphasize that negative emotions actually should be explored, that you cannot avoid that energy. And I totally agree. As a psychologist, we try to avoid, push down, distract ourselves from anger, distress, sadness, hatred. It's actually really important for us to experience and understand where those emotions come from. And as I mentioned, the difference is that the Sith will value those negative emotions and allow them to inform their actions. And this is sort of where like Rey and Kylo Ren are different here, is that, Kylo Ren is more likely to allow his emotions to inform and drive his actions. And I think a lot of us fall into that. How could we not be susceptible to that? But as we know, it can be really destructive.
Yeah. Well, and they're like the literal dyad or whatever they call them in The Rise of Skywalker. But it does seem, now that we're talking about it, that everything in Star Wars is so very light and dark. Somewhere in the middle here, there's got to be a balance.
Absolutely. Right.
So I know we've talked a bit about the sequel trilogy. Something I noticed, at least probably the first time I really noticed psychology potential links to Star Wars, was in The Mandalorian. Which hopefully you are up on and have watched, so that we're not spoiling anything. But I, having not watched the Clone Wars, didn't really know all the background information about Mandalore and the smaller splinter group that always wears their helmets and all those sorts of things. So it was very interesting for me to see that play out in the live action version of, it seems to me as though Mando has been raised in a cult and only found this out as an adult. And that's a lot to go through. He watched his parents get killed. He got, adopted into a new family, and then to be separated them and find out that they're living a very different life than they need to be is got to do a number on him, right?
I agree. I loved the series, and I think it's for similar reasons that, of course, we're really shaped by our experiences and this sense of becoming a part of a community and adopting those practices. I did a Comic-Con panel, and we talked about the way that this community maybe had some positive aspects to that sense of membership, that sense of value and affirmation. You belong here. But then the negative aspects or outcomes around what it takes to belong there. What really are the ideals and where does that take you? Those aspects are pretty consistent throughout Star Wars in the sense that, as I said, yes, all of us are looking for belonging. What happens when you feel connected to a group or a community or a philosophy that's actually kind of harmful? Maybe it's harmful to you. Maybe it's harmful for other communities. That's been a pretty consistent part of Star Wars, this sense of like, hey, I'm drawn to the dark side, or I'm drawn to the, whatever potential negative, community that could be. And there's a ton of symbology with that. And I think, again, we go into places, we go into territory that I don't see a lot of other franchises go into as much. They're willing to be really frank and direct about the harm that can happen when we get involved with these forces.
So do you think that, as he's been, left his community and now is out in the world, essentially, that he's kind of gone from like a fixed mindset? Is he starting to move out of that into a growth mindset?
I think so. The cool thing about a growth mindset is this aspect that just not necessarily willing yourself, but being open to expanding your mind and expanding your literal skill set is a way to undo some of the harm that's been done from having anything from like discriminatory experiences to traumatic experiences to just sort of feeling like you lost your way. And so I'm excited for this character. He is, at the precipice of what could potentially be a lot of growth for him and a lot of discovery. And yet he's also sort of marked by this rebellious identity too. Like, you've walked away from something. You've you've made a decision. I think about Ahsoka, like you've walked away from this. You've made a decision that serves you. What does that mean for your sense of self? It's a huge decision and it's a powerful one.
It seems to me that the Mandalorian goes from sort of one pseudo family to another. There's the other Mandalorians. And then, when he goes out on his own, he's a bounty hunter, but there's still sort of that guild, that sort of camaraderie. And then I wonder if that helps his sort of attachment then with the child, is this feeling of like having to have some sort of connection. And I wonder what's going to happen in season 3 now that Grogu is gone off with, spoiler alert, Luke. What's next? Is he going to find someone else to connect with?
Yeah, I think what's pretty consistent, when you think about his personality, there is that sense of duty. He needs to find a mission. He needs to find a sense of purpose. And that's been shifted. He doesn't strike me as the kind of person, like maybe many people he knows, that would just sort of like chill for a while and just be self-indulgent. Yeah, I think he sees himself as someone who needs to work hard and sacrifice and be in service. So what will that look like? And again, it's really relatable because that's how many of us, that's our psychology. That's a lot of people's psychology is, I do want to have purpose in this universe. And I also want to know, who am I in service to? Meaning, how am I contributing to my community or to others who can benefit from my vision, my skills, my passion? I'm not just here for me, So that's, I think, a really important theme that comes up in Star Wars quite a bit.
I'm curious if there is any well-adjusted character in Star Wars. Like, is there someone you can tell us they've got it? That's who you should try to emulate.
Oh, what a great question. No one has asked me this. A lot of people ask me about who's not well, who's disordered. And I'd say that Leia is probably a character who, of course, struggles and faces hardships and has to make really difficult decisions. And this is something that I often say when I teach or when I work with young people, students and others, that being resilient doesn't mean you're free of distress. It doesn't mean that you're avoiding, you're sort of being able to shift away from any kind of hardship. It means that you're willing to face difficulties and to face challenges, and that you see, in some cases, how you can grow and learn from those setbacks. And I think Leia is a really good example of someone who is able to tolerate uncertainty and able to face difficult futures. And speaking of mindfulness, I think she's able to withstand a lot of those very strong situations and emotions that she might encounter. And the reason she comes up too is that she looks at relationships as a part of that resilient pathway, that it's how she relates to and forms bonds with others that is a part of her sense of self. And again, that goes back to collective liberation, or this sense of community care, that finding your own healing can often come from revisiting and reframing your relationships, your healthy relationships with other people. So I would say that she's an example of someone who is psychologically pretty healthy.
What about Chewbacca?
We don't know, right?
I always think of him as like one of the best characters in Star Wars in terms of like actual moral goodness, that, he embodies that loyalty and willingness to sacrifice so much just for the people around him.
I agree with that. And I'd say, of course, he's loyal. He doesn't exactly have the cleanest mouth. Right? Like he has cursing here and there, but yes. And I want to bring up a complexity to that, because being loyal doesn't necessarily mean you're well. But I think Chewbacca is a character who is, I think it's a wisdom too, because we know him when he's quite a bit older than others. He's had a lot of lived experience. He's had a lot of loss. He's seen a lot of war. I think that he is really shaped by those experiences, and he doesn't give an F. Like it comes to a point where he's just like, it is what it is.
Right. I was wondering that about R2D2 also. And I feel like that's a whole different episode. We'll maybe have you back on to talk about the psychology of droids. But I love, sassy R2 or sad R2 or happy R2 or excited, like you always know what emotion R2 is feeling. But maybe that's also doesn't mean well adjusted, and also definitely some cursing. So I don't know if cursing is a sign that
I think that's healthy.
And I am also not well.
Yes, it is, James. Yeah, there are some studies that show that some moderate amount of expressing your feelings through cursing is it's not indicative of anything unhealthy, and it might actually help people.
Okay, well, wrapping up, if people were interested in going to clinical psychology or just psychology in general, what should they do?
Great question. It's so important to talk to people in the field. And I say this because when you want to go into psychology, if you want to become a psychologist, specifically a clinical psychologist or forensic psychologist or experimental psychologist, these are all different classifications in the field of psychology. It requires a PhD. And for many of us, that's a 5 to 7 year journey. So you don't want to sign up for that until you feel pretty committed to that decision. And talking to others who are either in graduate school or who have finished and they're in the profession is a helpful way to understand, what is that training and academic world like? And then what happens after that? What are the kinds of jobs that you can get? And what are the kinds of opportunities you can get? As a shortcut, I often tell my students, if you want to do therapy, you have a ton of choices. You can get a master's degree. You can get a PsyD, which is another kind of graduate degree. You could get a PhD, but you don't need all those things to be a therapist or counselor. So there are a ton of options. If you want to really broaden your professional landscape and teach and train and maybe do some therapy, but also potentially do some consultation, like I do. I work at UCLA as a psychologist, and I also work for Fandom and other entertainment media companies as a consultant and advisor. I think a PhD is helpful because you have all of the science to back up your decision making, and that has really helped me personally to get those subject matter expert positions.
Drea, can you tell us a little bit about where to find you on social media or read some of the great articles you put together?
Yeah, so folks can go to my website, drdreapsychology.com. And there you'll find 2 podcasts, actually. You'll find Lattes with Leia, which is the podcast that I did with Amy Ratcliffe. It's all things Star Wars. It's super fun. And the other podcast that I host is the Arkham Sessions, which is about the psychology of Batman and related universes. And actually, we're talking at a great time because we're just about to announce, and by the time this airs, it will be public, that we're going to cover the Marvel Cinematic Universe on the Arkham Session. So we're crossing over into Marvel, and we're starting with Iron Man, and we're timing things up to intersect with Loki when the show comes out. So a ton of fun things to cover, and a pretty big direction that we're taking, given that up till now, for the past 7 years, we've been pretty DC focused. And so you can also find on my website the articles about a whole bunch of characters that we've talked about, Kylo Ren and Rey, and other Marvel, Disney, and fictional characters that I've written about. So you can find all that on my website. On Twitter and Instagram, you can find me at Arkham Asylum Doc.
Great. Thanks so much, Drea, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Letamendi.
Thank you both so much for having me on the show, and again for creating this podcast. I think these conversations are so much needed, and they're going to benefit so many people.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Drea Letamendi, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
We especially want to thank those of you who have reached out to us on Twitter. Thank you so much at A Rural Farm Boy for always sharing our content and being our #1 fan.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of great shows like classic Marvel Star Wars comics, the Max FX podcast, Resilience Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. You can find all of these shows at skywalkingnetwork.com.
Got an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies, or know an expert in their field that we should interview? Let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's Star Wars, OLOGIES, at gmail.com.
No topic is off limits, even the taxation of trade routes and outlying systems.
And also check out our YouTube channel. We do a video version. It has screenshots from the scenes we mentioned.
And remember to please like, comment, and subscribe.
Join us next time on Star Warsologies to talk about beer and alcohol in Star Wars.